Welcome back to the What You're More podcast. I'm your host, Quinton Harris. We are essentially a week out from the NAR settlement, and we still have some things that we're waiting to hear about, but we have a clear view of what things look like now versus what they did last Friday. So we're going to take this episode to explain a little bit about this proposed settlement and what it means and what does that look like for the industry, as well as some of the misconceptions that are happening. You guys know how I feel about the media. I don't hold anything back on that. And this just adds to some of the journalistic problems that we're having in our industry, and this is really kicked it off as far as real estate agents in particular, and some of the it's negative connotation that the media is putting out there and some false narrative about benefits to buyers. So that's what I'm going to recap today. But before I start, for those that haven't heard or aren't aware or didn't listen to an episode, there was a significant ruling that happened with Sitzer Burnett trial down in Missouri that ended in the tune of $5.3 billion in the plaintiff's favors against some defendants. One of those defendants happened to be NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors. And so in this case, they have a proposed settlement of $418 million into a court basically controlled trust over the next 4 years. And so inside of that, there's four major things. Number one is the $418 million into a trust over the next 4 years. The second one is to abolish the participation rule that required the sell-side agents to make an offer of compensation to the buyer brokers. Essentially, the whole point of the court case was that there was this coercion between NAR members and the MLS, meaning that if I'm a selling agent and I'm wanting to help you list your property, if you want to put that property in the MLS, then we would need to offer compensation to the buyer side paid for by the seller in order to go into the MLS. So that's been abolished. That's being completely wiped off. The third one is the broker compensation will no longer appear in the MLS field data. You would normally advertise, or you would see listing agents advertise that dual compensation. You know, seller will pay, let's say, 3% buyer commission. That would normally advertise, thus giving a buyer's agent an indication that there's a dual commission and making them aware of essentially what they would make on that buy and sell of that property. That's now no longer going to be there. The fourth and final part of the proposed settlement is that the MLS participants that work with buyers have to enter into a written buyer's agreement. So what that means is that if I'm a buyer's agent and you want to buy a home and you approach me and say, Quinton, I would like to enlist your service as a real estate agent to help me buy a home. Before I can show you a home, before we can engage in any type of contract, you and I would have to agree upon a clear and precise monetary number or percentage that is close-ended, meaning that I would have to disclose if you would like my services are going to be X. And there's multiple ways I can have those services. There's ways you could do an a la carte menu, or you could just say, hey, it's going to be 2%, or it's going to be $500, but it has to be clear and precise. It can't be open-ended. It has to be a closed-ended agreement. And so the interesting thing about this is that according to NAR, this proposed settlement would end all litigation from home sellers that are essentially suing NAR. Now, the Sitzer Burnett trial, that took place in Missouri, but there's been so many copycat episodes around and case filings after that this had to come to an end at some point. And so this is NAR's way of ending those copycat episodes. But this lawsuit doesn't necessarily take care of the ones that have been filed by home buyers. I did want to disclose that because there's two that are being done by home buyers known as Batten 1 and Batten 2. So again, this proposed settlement only handles the sell side. And so first thing I asked myself is, how long is this going to take? And right now we know that this is proposed to be taken care of by July. So it really only gives NAR and also, I guess, the MLS and the whole real estate industry 4 months to put this whole thing together. And I think that's the tricky part, because that goes pretty quickly. And more importantly, there's so much to cover. There's so many what ifs during this. I think we had a list of like 10 possibilities and what ifs when we did this back in February I think it was back in October when we did this, that some of this stuff still hasn't been addressed. It's a little still chaotic, and I think that's the fear-mongering that's happening out there. We know that in July is when this is supposed to take effect. As we get into that, let's talk about a couple things I know that are, false narratives, right? And so I think there's some false narratives. It seems like to me that the media is doing a very poor job educating customers on what is and isn't really taking place. But more importantly, customers also have this preconceived notion of real estate agents and what they do. For example, I've interviewed quite a few people that are not in the real estate industry, and here's what I hear. For some reason, there's this narrative that if you are a buyer's agent, you're only a buyer's agent. Like if Charlie, my producer, is buying a home, I would work with Charlie because let's say I'm a buyer's agent. But if Charlie was selling his home, there's this notion that Charlie would only work with a listing agent. And I think that's a common misconception because agents represent both. They do both sides quite often, more than not often, right? And so there's not just dedicated agents that only work with one group of sellers and one group of buyers. Oftentimes they work with both sides, not necessarily on the same transaction, but both sides of different transactions. So I think it's important to address that because it seems to be some confusion on the consumer side of that. So let me take a look at this. Well, if I'm a consumer, what does this potential settlement mean to me? Here's one thing I would like to start with. If you're the plaintiff's counsel or you're the Department of Justice, congratulations. You got what you wanted, right? You got what you wanted. You got some things abolished. You've got the changing of guard of the MLS. But what's interesting to me is if you're the plaintiff's counsel, you're getting paid big. It's a big payday for you. And congratulations to you. But here's what's interesting. If you are one of the, let's call it harmed sellers, right? If you're one of the harmed sellers in this lawsuit, you're getting pennies on the dollar, like pennies on the dollar. So the plaintiff's attorneys are extracting $500 million from NAR, $500 million, and they're making all the money. But yet the people that are considered harmed in this whole thing are getting pennies on the dollar. So congratulations to the plaintiff's counsel and the DOJ. You guys are the winners here because the consumer is not. And so anytime the government gets involved, anytime in the history of the United States, when the government gets involved inside of private businesses and regulates them, the consumer loses. And again, that's what's happening here on this particular settlement. There is not a standout winner here. I've heard some people argue the side that, yeah, the seller's winning because now they have to pay for the buyer's side of things. But I'm going to break down why I think that's not the case as well. Financially, in the one transaction, yes, but in the long run, they're going to lose as well. I look at this as this has the feeling that this really wasn't about helping the harmed consumer or the harmed seller. This had the feeling that it was about, I don't know, extracting and making money here and maybe punishing an industry because the DOJ, let's face it, the DOJ has been after the real estate industry for quite some time. This isn't the first shot they've taken. It's just maybe the big dent that they're making, right? And so this regulation doesn't feel like it was there to help the consumer, in my opinion. Why? Because here's how I look at this. If you're a seller that was the harmed seller in this transaction, in this lawsuit, you're getting pennies on the dollar. So let's start there. You really didn't get any financial reward for being quote unquote harmed. Okay, so now you're a property owner. You go to sell your property. If you're a seller in this lawsuit or if you're a seller that's a future seller and you go to sell your property, okay, you may or may not end up paying the buyer's side of things as far as the buyer's real estate agent. You may not end up paying that person. So the buyer has to pay it. What happens when you become the buyer now? What happens when you go to buy your next transaction? Oh, wait. You're now going to have to pay for that. See, I think that something that's lost in this whole argument here is the premise of this lawsuit were that these sellers, these group of sellers around the country, they were so harmed. Oh my gosh, they were just harmed by these terrible real estate agents who did nothing but provide value and write a contract and help with many different things, such as schedulings of appraisals, helping with inspections, dealing with any issues on the inspection. I mean, the list goes on and on. They got paid for doing their job. Can you imagine someone not getting paid to do their job? Could you go to an attorney's office and expect an attorney to represent you and then not pay them? What's the difference between when an attorney takes a case on the assumption of winning and then they don't win, right? Do they still get paid some? Yeah, they get a small retainer, but they're still getting paid. But when they do win, the losing side pays their legal fees. I mean, maybe that's a far reach, but you get what I'm saying here. To think that someone should do their job for a, I don't know, minimal fee is a little ridiculous when we're talking about the transaction of your house. We're not talking about a transaction of, I don't know, an iPhone, right? Or something at the Apple store. We're talking about a transaction of a house, right? That technically is appreciating in value. So I don't know. To me, I get a little bent on this. And you might say, well, Hugh, that's because you're in the real estate business. You work with real estate agents. I do. And I see the good that they do. And I see the value they provide, which is probably why I get so riled up about this, because I feel like it was minimized by the media and it's been minimized since this case took place. And so the first time we did this podcast, a lot of people came in hot on that episode and you could really see how people feel about real estate agents, right? I think that's because you think of real estate agents maybe either a bad experience that you had, right? Not everybody's had bad ones, but some have, and I get that. That goes with any industry, by the way, though. Have you ever gone to a doctor's office and had a bad experience? Have you ever gone to a restaurant and had a bad experience? Every industry has a bad experience. There's no perfect set industries. To hold that against an entire slew of real estate agents in the industry by saying, oh, well, I had a bad experience, all of them are like this, all of them are overpaid, is the most absurd thing that we could have in the form of an argument. But I think the other thing is this. I think a lot of people lump real estate agents into the Phil Dunphys of the world. And I think that's something that we look at because they do a good job of poking fun of him on that show and his mannerisms and how he acts. And you think that everybody's like that. I've seen that too. And that's definitely not the case. And so I'll go into this. Going back to when regulation enters a business, it's not good for the consumer. So think about when regulation entered banking. We started a long time ago, but I'm going to go to the most recent regulation. Let's talk about when the CFPB came in 2010 and regulated how lenders are going to pay loan officers. Well, that was supposed to be for the greater good of the consumer. There's not a consumer that won during that. Cost went up, structures changed, the consumer didn't win. And all that did was alter the way that the banks and lenders made money, because that always is going to be pushed back down, and that goes for any business, just like this is going to happen in real estate. I can assure you of this. The consumer's not going to win. You know, the New York Times went as far as writing an article, and they call it the New Deal, right? This is now the New Deal. And in this New Deal, they state, they were quoted, I want to make sure I have here, billions of savings that home buyers will now have will release more inventory and lower home prices. Let me repeat that. Billions in savings that the home buyers will now have, meaning that, oh my gosh, if I'm going to list my home now, that I'm going to actually not list it at what I think it's worth because I'm going to reduce it because I don't have to pay a buyer's agent on the other side. This is going to create billions of savings and release more inventory and lower home prices. Like, you freaking kidding me with that? Are you absolutely kidding me? That this is called the New Deal. And of course, they would call it the New Deal. This is the most ridiculous deal is what it is. There is not a single seller that's sitting back going, man, I was going to list my home for $1 million. But now because I don't have to pay a buyer's agent, I'm going to list it for less than that. And that to think they would even do the math to calculate that down is ridiculous. This isn't going to release billions of dollars. Home prices are going to continue to stay where they are, and just like historical averages have shown, they're going to continue to go up. The only thing this is going to do is jeopardize transactions for the ones that are trying to be affordable. And let me say this, that is the biggest challenge we have in the housing market right now, is affordability. Affordability is the biggest challenge we have, whether it's in the form of rate, higher home prices, and ultimately first-time home buyers. This does nothing to help any of that. Why? Because now the buyers, these future homeowners, these first-time homeowners, they're already scrapping money together to make the smaller down payment. Now they've got to make the down payment and hopefully pay a buyer's agent to help them buy a home. Well, I mean, the flip side of that is maybe they don't use a buyer's agent, right? Maybe they just call up the listing agent and they go, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, I'm the first-time home buyer that would like to buy that home. Now, let's just assume there's not multiple offers. And let's just assume there's not multiple people calling that listing agent. And let's also assume that this is the only person wanting to buy this home. I think you guys know where I'm going with that. So this first-time home buyer has all the attention right now, right? Again, that is being sarcastic. So they call in and they want to get information on this home and they want to buy it, and then they want to write a contract ultimately. Who's representing them in that transaction? Who's looking out for them in that transaction? And that's no disrespect to the listing agent, because I understand how this works. But the listing agent is representing the seller. And some states even have rules against representing both sides too. Other states have transactional laws when it comes to real estate. How does that work? What does that look like? And there's more questions involved with that. And let me take it a step further. What if it's a VA buyer? VA buyers, we all know that we want to help our vets. We want to help our current armed forces. What does it look like when they want to go buy a home and they have no problem paying a buyer's agent to go help them do that? But guess what? They can't, because the HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development, they have rules in place that veterans are not allowed to pay those fees. So wait a minute, we've got departments that are not working together. And we've got rules in place that actually could punish the veterans in the form of they wouldn't be able to use a real estate agent because they can't pay for the real estate agent. So then that bodes the question, there's no way the real estate agent can do it for free. They can't expect to do their job for free. So there's another byproduct. There's another issue where when you take a look at this, what were they thinking? So I want to put some charts up in our YouTube channel. And actually, they're not charts. They're just discussion points and slides with all this information in there in our YouTube channel. At what's your one more with the number one, at what's your one more with the number one. Before I get on to the biggest winners and losers of this, I just want you guys to check that out. Go there. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. We'd love to have you guys follow us there because we're putting a lot of good information on there. And the feedback that you guys are giving us is tremendous. We greatly appreciate it. So let me get back to this. So we know when we talk about the winners and losers, the first thing let's talk about is the repercussions of some of this. And what I mean by this is, so we talked about when regulation happens that no one wins. So now we've got a buyer that's having to buy a home. It's going to cost them more money to buy a home in an already basically strained affordability market. We've got sellers that when they depart their home, they've got to go somewhere. So when a seller sells a home, yeah, they won financially in that transaction. But what do they do next? They got to buy another home. What are they going to do? They're going to spend more to buy the other home and pay the additional cost. That circle of life starts to work and not really benefit the seller there. And then third and final thing is that these buyers, agents are going to have to come up with agency agreements. Now, in some states, this has already been used. I think in Washington, they've been doing this since 2020, right? There's been no MLS there since 2020, and it's business as usual, right? Usual to them is not the same as it is in the other 49 states, right? Because buyers brokerage agreements aren't adapted everywhere yet. They're not adopted, they're not used everywhere yet, but they're going to start to become one. And the thing is this, now you're going to be sitting in front of a buyer, first-time home buyer, maybe it's a move-up buyer, maybe it's a third, fourth time, second home buyer. They haven't really seen one of these, and now that's having to be explained on agreed upon commission before they show you a home, before they show you their services. You have to agree to that. Now, there's a lot of agents that have great reps, and that'll be easy for them to say, this is what I do, this is what I've done, this is my body of work. But what if you're a newer agent in the business? Or what if you don't have that body of work yet? What if you don't have that scope of work that you could show to be done, and yet you're having to sit across the table and explain what that is? It should be, it's going to make for a difficult conversation. And so I think that's another byproduct, in my opinion, that doesn't seem to be a big win here. Now, I mean, an argument could be, well, hey, it's great to have a buyer's brokerage agreement because in doing such, now I, the agent, am protected when they go to buy a home. And I could see that argument, protected being my commission's already predetermined when they go to buy a home. I could see that being the win there for that. But let's talk about this. Who are some of the winners and losers in this? I've already talked about the consumer from the buyer side and the seller side, service level side. Let's talk about this. Inside these articles, and I mean, there are countless articles since last Friday. Most of them are wrong. Most of them are written by people that are not in the real estate industry. Let me preface that. But I think some of the losers here, because the analogy is that, oh, now people can just go online, they'll just look at the homes, they'll find what they want, and they'll make the call. Well, okay. So where do most people go first? Let's just go ahead and call it as they're going to go to Zillow first. Then they might go to realtor.com. They might go to homes.com, since homes.com is spending $1 gazillion on advertising right now. But let's say they go to Zillow first. Here's what's interesting. Where does Zillow make most of its money? Off of real estate agents. Why? Because they sell a product to real estate agents in the form of leads and advertising space. Well, which agents are they selling to? Listing or buying agents? They're selling to buying agents because you're buying leads so you can show that buyer a home to sell it. If the buying agent is having compression and their revenue is coming down, are they going to spend more money with Zillow? No. And that's why Zillow's stock price fell 12%. I think it fell the bottom out at 12, recovered a little bit back at 9, but it fell significantly on Friday, as well as Redfin. So then let's look at CoStar, right? CoStar is homes.com, right? CoStar owns homes.com, apartments.com. Well, what's interesting is homes.com was up big on Friday. So then that makes you scratch your head and go, how can Zillow be down and homes.com be up? Well, that's because homes.com advertises with listing agents. They've got it dialed into where listing agents are paying them, not buyers agents. So they're reaping the benefit of that as a winner that day in the market. And so it's interesting to see how that's going to continue because Zillow does have a strategy, but they admitted that there will be significant revenue loss due to this ruling and due to the settlement from NAR on Friday. So let's talk a couple last things here. So the settlement part of it reads this proposed settlement. I need to get better at saying that, proposed settlement, but the proposed settlement reads that off-market or off-MLS sites can advertise the dual commission. So if you're putting it on the MLS, you can't advertise that. But If you put it on an offsite, meaning a private website, so let's say you're working with a large real estate company and they have their own private website, they could list all the homes and all the commission information about that home for the buyer's side on that property on that website. Could probably also do that on an off MLS site such as Zillow or on realtor.com or on Redfin. The challenge with Zillow, realtor.com, and Redfin is that the MLS feeds those sites the data. That's where they get the data from. So if you can't put it on the MLS, how are you going to get it on those sites? Which then poses the question is, how powerful are the bigger brokerages that have a larger outreach? Because now they have the means to advertise that information to the general public at a larger scale than maybe a smaller brokerage that doesn't quite have that scale. And that's something that is going to be interesting to watch from a consolidation phase, how that works. And if you don't think there'll be consolidation from this, it'll happen in two ways. Number one, I do think the big get bigger here. And then number two is I think this is going to cause some people to get out of the business that can't adapt and can't modify their business model to make it work for them moving in to this new era of real estate they're in. You know, I was telling one of my friends, I'm like, listen, this is the first time real estate industry really has had any type of regulatory crackdown, if you may, or interference in your business model in probably my lifetime. And I'm like, I feel like the federal government does that over here on the lending side like every 3 to 4 years. And I'm not saying, hey, that's great. I'm just saying that maybe we're a little more numb to it on this side. But this is a major change if you're in the world of real estate. But here's the thing. The men and women that are real estate agents and the brokerages and the owners, they will adapt and they will find a way to make this work and they will be successful. And granted, there will be some that get out. But at the end of the day, the bottom line to me, the brokers, the agents, they're going to adapt. They always have, they always will. And some are going to get out. That's just the way it works. But I'm extremely confident that the real estate agents that are here today, some are going to make this work very successfully, while there will be others that get out. But the confidence level of a buyer's agent going away, or you're never going to have to pay for something, that's not going to happen. You'll always have to pay for something, and you'll always find a way to provide value. And that's the biggest thing. Value in this value in this particular industry, that is what's going to prevail here, as well as education, as well as relationships. That's just how it is. That's how it works in this industry. And going back to that attorney comment, that I thought it was interesting, because if you have an a la carte menu, if you may, for someone to order off of, I bet there are real estate agents that are going to make more money in this new environment. Once they find their space, once they find how they're going to make this work, at the end of the day, I bet there's more agents making more money for two reasons. Number one, what I just described, the adaptation. Number two, a lot of agents are going to get out of the business. And then when they do, you're going to have less agents doing more volume. That typically results in higher income as well. So, guys, wanted to make sure I got this out there. I'm sure there's going to be more develops. I'm sure there'll be more between now and July, but I wanted to make sure I shared that and say, hey, listen, this is not doom and gloom that the news wants to put out there. And this is not all this creation of new billions of dollars for buyers and sellers out there. There is a narrative that's incorrect, which is what I wanted to share today, and also talk about some of the biggest winners and losers out of this transaction. Guys, if you like what you're hearing, 5-star review this podcast. Please leave us some comments on Apple or Spotify. Check out our YouTube channel at What's Your One More. Until the next episode, we will see you guys at What's Your One More.
I got one more shot, I'm gonna make it. One more chance, I'm gonna take it. I meant it when I said it, now it's time for me to do it. I got one life to live, so I put my all into it, yeah.